The Archeology of Knowledge by Michel Foucault, Chapter 3, The Formation of Objects. We must now list the various directions that lie open to us and see whether this notion of rules of formation, of which little more than a rough sketch has so far been provided, can be given real content. Let us look first at the formation of objects, and in order to facilitate our analysis, let us take as an example the discourse of psychopathology from the 19th century onwards. A chronological break that is easy enough to accept in a first approach to the subject. There are enough signs to indicate it. But let us take just two of these. The establishment at the beginning of the century of a new mode of exclusion and confinement of the madman in a psychiatric hospital, and the possibility of tracing certain present-day notions back to Esquirol, Einroth, or Pinel. Paranoia can be traced back to monomania. The intelligence quotient to the initial notion of imbecility. General paralysis to chronic encephalitis. Character neurosis to non-delirious madness. Whereas, if we try to trace the development of psychopathology beyond the 19th century, we soon lose our way. The path becomes confused, and the projection of Du Laurens or even von Swieten on the pathology of Kraepelin or Bleuler provides no more than chance coincidences. The objects with which psychopathology has dealt since this break in time are very numerous, mostly very new, but also very precarious, subject to change and, in some cases, to rapid disappearance, in addition to motor disturbances, hallucinations, and speech disorders, which were already regarded as manifestations of madness, although they were recognized, delimited, described, and analyzed in a different way. Objects appeared that belonged to hitherto unused registers. Minor behavioral disorders, sexual aberrations and disturbances, and phenomena of suggestion and hypnosis, lesions of the central nervous system, deficiencies of intellectual or motor adaptation, criminality, and on the basis of each of these registers a variety of objects were named, circumscribed, analyzed, then rectified, redefined, challenged, erased. Is it possible to lay down the rule to which their appearance was subject? Is it possible to discover according to which non-deductive system these objects could be juxtaposed and placed in succession to form the fragmented field? showing at certain points great gaps, at others a plethora of information or of psychopathology. What has ruled their existence as objects of discourse? Question mark. A. First, we must map the first surfaces of their emergence. Show where these individual differences, which, according to the degrees of rationalization, conceptual codes, and types of theory, will be accorded the status of disease, alienation, anomaly, dementia, neurosis, or psychosis, degeneration, etc., may emerge and then be designated and analyzed. These surfaces of emergence are not the same for different societies at different periods and in different forms of discourse. In the case of 19th century psychopathology, they were probably constituted by the family, the immediate social group, the work situation, the religious community, which are all normative, which are all susceptible to deviation, which all have a margin of tolerance and a threshold beyond which exclusion is demanded, which all have a mode of designation and a mode of rejecting madness, which all transfer to medicine, if not the responsibility for treatment and cure, at least the burden of explanation. Although organized according to a specific mode, these surfaces of emergence were not new in the 19th century. On the other hand, it was no doubt at this period that new surfaces of appearance began to function. Art with its own normativity, sexuality, its deviations in relation to customary prohibitions, become for the first time an object of observation, description, and analysis for psychiatric discourse. Penality, whereas in previous periods madness was carefully distinguished from criminal conduct and was regarded as an excuse, criminality itself becomes, and subsequent to the celebrated homicidal monomanias, a form of deviance more or less related to madness. In these fields of initial differentiation, in the distances, the discontinuities, and the thresholds that appear within it, psychiatric discourse finds a way of limiting its domain, of defining what it is talking about, of giving it the status of an object, and therefore of making it manifest, nameable, and describable. Number B, we must also describe the authorities of delimitation. In the 19th century, medicine, as an institution possessing its own rules as a group of individuals, constituting the medical profession as a body of knowledge and practice, as an authority, recognized by public opinion, the law and government became the major authority in society that delimited, designated, named, and established madness as an object. But it was not alone in this. The law and penal law in particular, with the definitions of excuse, non-responsibility, extenuating circumstances, and with the application of such notions as the crime passionnel, hereditary, danger to society, the religious authority, insofar as it set itself up as the authority that divided the mystical from the pathological, the spiritual from the corporeal, the supernatural from the abnormal, and insofar as it practiced the direction of conscience with a view to understanding individuals rather than carrying out a casuistical classification of actions and circumstances. Literary and art criticism, which in the 19th century treated the work less and less as an object of taste that had to be judged, and more as a language that had to be interpreted, and in which the author's tricks of expression had to be recognized. Number C, lastly, we must analyze the grids of specification. These are the systems according to which the different kinds of madness are divided, contrasted, related, regrouped, classified, derived from one another as objects of psychiatric discourse. In the 19th century, these grids of difference were the soul as a group of hierarchized, related, and more or less interpenetrable faculties. The body as a three-dimensional volume of organs linked together by networks of dependence and communication. The life and history of individuals as a linear succession of phases, a tangle of traces, a group of potential reactivations, cyclical repetitions, the interplays of neuropsychological correlations as systems of reciprocal projections, and as a field of circular causality. Such a description is still in itself inadequate. And for two reasons. These planes of emergence, authorities of delimitation or forms of specification, do not provide objects fully formed and armed that the discourse of psychopathology has then merely to list, classify, name, select, and cover with a network of words and sentences. It is not the families with their norms, their prohibitions, their sensitivity thresholds that decide who is mad and present the patients to the psychiatrists for analysis and judgment. It is not the legal system itself that hands over certain criminals to psychiatry, that sees paranoia beyond a particular murder or a neurosis behind a sexual offense. It would be quite wrong to see discourse as a place where previously established objects are laid one after another like words on a page. But the above enumeration is inadequate for a second reason. It has located one after another several planes of differentiation in which the objects of discourse may appear. But what relations exist between them? Why is this enumeration rather than another? What defined and closed group does one imagine one is circumscribing in this way? And how can one speak of a system of formation if one knows only a series of different heterogeneous determinations lacking attributable links and relations? In fact, these two series of questions refer back to the same point. In order to locate that point, let us re-examine the previous example. In the sphere with which psychopathology dealt in the 19th century, one sees very early appearance, as early as Esquirol, of a whole series of objects belonging to the category of delinquency, homicide and suicide, crime passionnel, sexual offenses, certain forms of theft, vagrancy, and then through them, hereditary. The neurogenic environment, aggressive or self-punishing behavior, perversions, criminal impulses, suggestibility, etc. It would be inadequate to say that one was dealing here with the consequences of a discovery, of the sudden discovery by a psychiatrist of a resemblance between criminal and pathological behavior, a discovery of the presence in certain delinquents of the classical signs of alienation or mental derangement. Such facts lie beyond the grasp of contemporary research. Indeed, the problem is how to decide what made them possible and how these discoveries, in quotation marks, could lead to others that took them up, rectified them, modified them, or even disproved them. Similarly, it would be irrelevant to attribute the appearance of these new objects to the norms of 19th century bourgeois society, to a reinforced police and penal framework, to the establishment of a new code of criminal justice, to the introduction and use of extenuating circumstances, to the increase in crime. No doubt, all these processes were at work, but they could not of themselves form objects for psychiatric discourse. To pursue the description at this level, one would fall short of what one was seeking. if in a particular period in the history of our society, the delinquent was psychologized and pathologized, if criminal behavior could give rise to a whole series of objects of knowledge, this was because a group of particular relations was adopted for use in psychiatric discourse. The relation between planes of specification, like penal categories and degrees of diminished responsibility, the planes of psychological characterization, faculties, aptitudes, degrees of development or involution, different ways of reacting to the environment, character types, whether acquired, innate, or hereditary. The relations between the authority of medical decision and the authority of judicial decision. A really complex relation, since medical decision recognizes absolutely the authority of the judiciary to define crime, to determine the circumstances in which it is committed and the punishment that it deserves, but reserves the right to analyze its origin and to determine the degree of responsibility involved. The relation between the filter formed by judicial interrogation, police information, investigation, and the whole machinery of judicial information, and the filter formed by the medical questionnaire, clinical examinations, the search for antecedents, and biographical accounts. The relation between the family, sexual and penal norms of the behavior of individuals, and the table of pathological symptoms and diseases of which they are the signs. The relations between therapeutic confinement in hospital, with its own thresholds, its criteria of cure, its way of distinguishing the normal from the pathological, and punitive confinement in prison, with its system of punishment and pedagogy, its criteria of good conduct, improvement, and freedom. These are the relations that, operating in psychiatric discourse, have made possible the formation of a whole group of various objects. Let us generalize. In the 19th century, psychiatric discourse is characterized not by privileged objects, but by the way in which it forms objects that are in fact highly dispersed. This formation is made possible by a group of relations established between authorities of emergence, delimitation, and specification. One might say, then, that a discursive formation is defined, as far as its objects are concerned at least, if one can establish such a group, if one can show how any particular object of discourse finds in it its place and law of emergence. If one can show that it may give birth simultaneously or successively to mutually exclusive objects without having to modify itself. Hence, a certain number of remarks and consequences. Number one, the conditions necessary for the appearance of an object of discourse, the historical conditions required if one is to say anything about it. And if several people are to say different things about it, the conditions necessary if it is to exist in relation to other objects, if it is to establish with them relations of resemblance, proximity, distance, difference, transformation. As we can see, these conditions are many and imposing, which means that one cannot speak of anything at any time. It is not easy to say something new. It is not enough for us to open our eyes, to pay attention, or to be aware. For new objects suddenly to light up and emerge out of the ground. But this difficulty is not only a negative one. It must not be attached to some obstacle whose power appears to be exclusively to blind, to hinder, to prevent discovery, to conceal the purity of the evidence, or the dumb obstinacy of the things themselves. The object does not await in limbo the order that will free it and enable it to become embodied in a visible and prolix objectivity. It does not pre-exist itself, held back by some obstacle at the first edges of light. It exists under the positive conditions of a complex group of relations. Number two, these relations are established between institutions, economic and social processes, behavioral patterns, systems of norms, techniques, types of classification, modes of characterization, and these relations are not present in the object. It is not that they are deployed when the object is being analyzed. They do not indicate the web, the immanent rationality, that ideal nervure that reappears totally or in part when one conceives of the object in the truth of its concept. They do not define in its internal constitution, but what enables it to appear, to juxtapose itself with other objects, to situate itself in relation to them, to define its difference, its irreducibility, and even perhaps its heterogeneity. In short, to be placed in a field of exteriority. Number three, These relations must be distinguished first from what we might call primary relations, and which, independently of all discourse or all object of discourse, may be described between institutions, techniques, social forms, etc. After all, we know very well that the relations existed between the bourgeois family and the functioning of judicial authorities in categories in the 19th century that can be analyzed in their own right. They cannot always be superposed upon the relations that go to form objects. The relations of dependence that may be assigned to this primary level are not necessarily expressed in the formation of relations that makes discursive objects possible. But we must also distinguish the secondary relations that are formulated in discourse itself. What, for example, the psychiatrists of the 19th century could say about the relations between the family and criminality does not reproduce, as we know, the interplay of real dependencies. But neither does it reproduce the interplay of relations that make possible and sustain the objects of psychiatric discourse. Thus, a space unfolds articulated with possible discourses, a system of real or primary relations, a system of reflexive or secondary relations, and a system of relations that might properly be called discursive. The problem is to reveal the specificity of these discursive relations and their interplay with the other two kinds. Number 4, discursive relations are not, as we can see, internal to discourse. They do not connect concepts or words with one another. They do not establish a deductive or rhetorical structure between propositions or sentences. Yet, they are not relations exterior to discourse, relations that might limit it or impose certain forms upon it or force it in certain circumstances to state certain things. They are, in a sense, at the limit of discourse. They offer its objects of which it can speak, or rather, for this image of offering presupposes that objects are formed independently of discourse. They determine the group of relations that discourse must establish in order to speak of this or that object, in order to deal with them, name them, analyze them, classify them, explain them, etc. These relations characterize not the language used by discourse, nor the circumstances in which it is deployed, but discourse itself as a practice. We can now complete the analysis. We can now complete the analysis and see to what extent it fulfills and to what extent it modifies the initial project. Taking those group figures which in an insistent but confused way presented themselves as psychology, economics, grammar, medicine, We asked on what kind of unity they could be based. Were they simply a reconstruction after the event, based on particular works, successive theories, notions, and themes of some of which had been abandoned, others maintained by tradition, and again others fated to fall into oblivion, only to be revived at a later date? Were they simply a series of linked enterprises? We sought the unity of discourse. We sought the unity of discourse in the objects themselves, in their distribution, in the interplay of their differences, in their proximity or distance, in short, in what is given to the speaking subject. And in the end, we are sent back to a setting up of relations that characterizes discursive practice itself. What we discover is neither a configuration nor a form, but a group of rules that are immanent in a practice and define it in its specificity. We sought the unity of discourse in the objects themselves, in their distribution, in the interplay of their differences, in their proximity or distance, in short, in what is given to the speaking subject. And in the end, we are sent back to a setting up of relations that characterizes discursive practice itself. And what we discover is neither a configuration nor a form, but a group of rules that are immanent in a practice and define it in its specificity. We also used as a point of reference a unity like psychopathology. If we had wanted to provide it with a date of birth and precise limits, it would no doubt have been necessary to discover when the word was first used, to what kind of analysis it could be applied, and how it achieved its separation from neurology on the one hand and psychology on the other. What has emerged is a unity of another type, which does not appear to have the same dates, or the same surfaces, or the same articulations, but which may take account of a group of objects for which the term psychopathology was merely a reflexive, secondary, classificatory rubric. Psychopathology finally emerged as a discipline in a constant state of renewal, subject to constant discoveries, criticisms, and corrected errors. The system of formation that we have defined remains stable. But let there be no misunderstanding. It is not the objects that remain constant, nor the domain that they form. It is not even their point of emergence or their mode of characterization, but the relation between the surfaces on which they appear, on which they can be delimited, on which they can be analyzed and specified. In the descriptions for which I have attempted to provide a theory, there can be no question of interpreting discourse with a view to writing a history of the referent. In the example chosen, we are not trying to find out who was mad at a particular period, or in what his madness consisted, or whether his disturbances were identical with those known to us today. We are not asking ourselves whether witches were unrecognized and persecuted madmen and madwomen, or whether at a different period a mystical or aesthetic experience was not unduly medicalized. We are not trying to reconstitute what madness itself might be in the form in which it first presented itself to some primitive, fundamental, deaf, scarcely articulated experience, and in the form in which it was later organized, translated, deformed, travestied, perhaps even repressed by discourses in the oblique, often twisted play of their operations. Such a history of the referent is no doubt possible, and I have no wish at the outset to exclude any efforts to uncover and free these pre-discursive experiences from the tyranny of the text. But what we are concerned with here is not to neutralize discourse, to make it the sign of something else, and to pierce through its density in order to reach what remains silently anterior to it, but, on the contrary, to maintain it in its consistency, to make it emerge in its own complexity. What, in short, we wish to do is to dispense with things, in quotation marks, to de-presentify, in quotation marks, them, to conjure up their rich, heavy, immediate plenitude, which we usually regard as the primitive law of a discourse that has become divorced from it through error, oblivion, illusion, ignorance, or the inertia of beliefs and traditions, or even the perhaps unconscious desire not to see and not to speak, to substitute for the enigmatic treasure of things interior to discourse, the regular formation of objects that emerge only in discourse. To define these objects without reference to the ground, the foundation of things, but by relating them to the body of rules that enable them to form as objects of a discourse, and thus constitute the conditions of their historical appearance. To write a history of discursive objects that does not plunge them into the common depth of a primal soil, but deploys the nexus of regularities that govern their dispersion. However, to suppress the stage of things themselves is not necessarily to return to the linguistic analysis of meaning. When one describes the formation of the objects of a discourse, one tries to locate the relations that characterize a discursive practice. One determines neither a lexical organization nor the scansions of a semantic field. One does not question the meaning given at a particular period to such words as melancholia or madness without delirium, nor the opposition of content between psychosis and neurosis. Not, I repeat, that such analysis are regarded as illegitimate or impossible, but they are not relevant when we are trying to discover, for example, how criminality could become an object of medical expertise, or sexual deviation a possible object of psychiatric discourse. The analysis of lexical contents defines either the elements of meaning at the disposal of speaking subjects in a given period, or the semantic structure that appears on the surface of a discourse that has already been spoken. It does not concern discursive practice as a place in which a tangled plurality, at once superposed and incomplete, of objects is formed and deformed, appears and disappears. The sagacity of the commentators is not mistaken. From the kind of analysis that I have undertaken, words are as deliberately absent as things themselves. Any description of a vocabulary is as lacking as any reference to the living plenitude of experience. We shall now return to the state anterior to discourse, in which nothing has yet been said, and in which things are only just beginning to emerge out of the gray light. And we shall not pass beyond discourse in order to rediscover the forms that it has created and left behind it. We shall remain, or try to remain, at the level of discourse itself, since it's sometimes necessary to dot the I's of even the most obvious absences. I will say that in all these searches in which I have still progressed so little, I would like to show that discourses, in the form in which they can be heard or read, are not, as one might expect, a mere intersection of things and words, an obscure web of things, and a manifest, visible, colored chain of words. I would like to show that discourse is not a slender surface of contact or confrontation between a reality and a language, the intrication of a lexicon and an experience. I would like to show with precise examples that in analyzing discourses themselves, one sees the loosening of the embrace, apparently so tight, of words and things, in the emergence of a group of rules proper to discursive practice. These rules define not the dumb existence of a reality, nor the canonical use of a vocabulary, but the ordering of objects, words, and things is the entirely serious title of a problem. It is the ironic title of a work that modifies its own form, displaces its own data, and reveals at the end of the day a quite different task. A task that consists of no longer treating discourses as groups of signs signifying elements referring to contents or representations, but as practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. Of course, discourses are composed of signs, but what they do is more than use these signs to designate things. It is this more that renders them irreducible to the language and to speech. It is this more that we must reveal and describe. Chapter 4, the formation of enunciative modalities. Qualitative descriptions, biographical accounts, the location, interpretation, and cross-checking of signs, reasonings by analogy, deduction, statistical calculations, experimental verifications, and many other forms of statement are to be found in the discourse of 19th century doctors. What is it that links them together? What necessity binds them together? Why these and not others? Before attempting an answer to such questions, we must first discover the law operating behind all these diverse statements and the place from which they come. Number A, first question. Who is speaking? Who, among the totality of speaking individuals, is accorded the right to use this sort of language? Who is qualified to do so? Who derives from it his own special quality, his prestige, and from whom, in return, does he receive, if not the assurance, at least the presumption that what he says is true? What is the status of the individuals who alone have the right, sanctioned by law or tradition, juridically defined by spontaneously accepted, to proffer such a discourse? The status of doctor involves criteria of competence and knowledge, institutions, systems, pedagogic norms, legal conditions that give the right, though not without laying down certain limitations, to practice and to extend one's knowledge. It also involves a system of differentiation and relations, the division of attributions, hierarchical subordination, functional complementarity, the request for and the provision and exchange of information with other individuals or other groups that also possess their own status, with the state and its representatives, with the judiciary, with the different professional bodies, with religious groups, and at times with priests. It also involves a number of characteristics that define its functioning in relation to a society as a whole, the role that is attributed to the doctor according to whether he is consulted by a private person or summoned, more or less under compulsion, by society, according to whether he practices a profession or carries out a function, the right to intervene or make decisions that is accorded him in these different cases. what is required of him as the supervisor, guardian, and guarantor of the health of a population, a group, a family, an individual. The payment that he receives from the community or from individuals. The form of contract, explicit or implicit, that he negotiates either with the group in which he practices or with the authority that entrusts him with a task, or with the patient who requests advice, treatment, or cure. This status of the doctor is generally a rather special one in all forms of society and civilization. He is hardly ever an undifferentiated or interchangeable person. Medical statements cannot come from anybody. Their value, efficacy, even their therapeutic powers, and generally speaking, their existence as medical statements cannot be dissociated from the statutorily defined person who has the right to make them and to claim for them the power to overcome suffering and death. But we also know that this status in Western civilization was profoundly modified at the end of the 18th century, when the health of the population became one of the economic norms required by industrial societies. We must also describe the institutional sites from which the doctor makes his discourse, and from which this discourse derives its legitimate source and point of application, its specific objects and instruments of verification. In our societies, these sites are the hospital, a place of constant, coded, systematic observation run by a differentiated and hierarchized medical staff, thus constituting a quantifiable field of frequencies. Private practice, which offers a field of less systematic, less complete, and far less numerous observations, but which sometimes facilitates observations that are more far-reaching in their effects, with a better knowledge of the background and the environment. The laboratory, an autonomous place, long distinct from the hospital, where certain truths of a general kind concerning the human body, life, disease, lesions, etc., which provides certain elements of the diagnosis, certain signs of the developing condition, certain criteria of cure, and which makes therapeutic experiment possible. Lastly, what might be called the library or documentary field, which includes not only the books and treatises traditionally recognized as valid, but also all the observation and case histories published and transmitted in the mass of statistical information concerning the social environment, climate epidemics, mortality rates, the incidence of diseases, the centers of contagion, occupational diseases, that can be supplied to the doctor by public bodies, by other doctors, by sociologists, and by geographers. In this respect, too, these various sites of medical discourse were profoundly modified in the 19th century. The importance of the document continues to increase, proportionately diminishing the authority of the book or tradition. The hospital, which had been merely a subsidiary site for discourse on diseases, and which took second place in importance and value to private practice, in which diseases left in their natural environment were, in the 18th century, to reveal themselves in their vegetal truth, then becomes the site of systematic, homogeneous observations, large-scale confrontations, the establishment of frequencies and probabilities, the annihilation of individual variance. In short, the site of the appearance of disease, not as a particular species, deploying its essential features beneath the doctor's gaze, but as an average process with its significant guidelines, boundaries, and potential development. Similarly, it was in the 19th century that daily medical practice integrated the laboratory as the site of a discourse that has the same experimental norms as physics, chemistry, or biology. Letter C. The positions of the subject are also defined by the situation that it is possible for him to occupy in relation to the various domains or groups of objects, according to a certain grid of explicit or implicit interrogations. He is the questioning subject, and according to a certain program of information, he is the listening subject. According to a table of characteristic features, he is the seeing subject. And according to a descriptive type, the observing subject. He is situated at an optimal perceptual distance whose boundaries delimit the wheat of relevant information. He uses instrumental intermediaries that modify the scale of the information, shift the subject in relation to the average or immediate perceptual level, ensure his movement from a superficial to a deep level, make him circulate in the interior space of the body, from manifest symptoms to the organs, from the organs to the tissues, and finally from the tissues to the cells. To these perceptual situations should be added the positions that the subject can occupy in the information networks. In theoretical teaching, or in hospital training, in the system of oral communication or of written communication, as emitter and receiver of observations, case histories, statistical data, general theoretical propositions, projects, and decisions, the various situations that the subject of medical discourse may occupy were redefined at the beginning of the 19th century with the organization of a quite different perceptual field, arranged in depth, manifested by successive recourse to instruments, deployed by surgical techniques or methods of autopsy, centered upon lesional sites, and with the establishment of new systems of registration, notation, description, classification, integration in numerical series and in statistics, with the introduction of new forms of teaching, the circulation of information, relations with other theoretical domains, sciences or philosophy, and with other institutions, whether administrative, political, or economic. If, in clinical discourse, the doctor is in turn the sovereign, direct questioner, the observing eye, the touching finger, the organ that deciphers signs, the point at which previously formulated descriptions are integrated, the laboratory technician, it is because a whole group of relations is involved. Relations between the hospital space as a place of assistance, of purified systematic observation, and of partially proved, partially experimental therapeutics, and a whole group of perceptual codes of the human body, as it is defined by morbid anatomy, relations between the field of immediate observations and the domain of acquired information, relations between the doctor's therapeutic role, his pedagogic role, his role as an intermediary in the diffusion of medical knowledge, and his role as a responsible representative of public health in the social space. Understood as a renewal of points of view, contents, the forms, and even the style of description, the use of inductive or probabilistic reasoning, types of attribution of causality, in short, as a renewal of the modalities of enunciation. Clinical medicine must not be regarded as the result of a new technique of observation, that of autopsy, which was practiced long before the advent of the 19th century, nor as the result of the search for pathogenic causes in the depths of the organism. Morgagni was engaged in such a search in the middle of the 18th century, nor as the effect of that new institution, the teaching hospital. Such institutions had already been in existence for some decades in Austria and Italy, nor as the result of the introduction of the concept of tissue in Bichat's Traité des Membranes, but as the establishment of a relation in medical discourse between a number of distinct elements, some of which concerned the status of doctors, others the institutional and technical site from which they spoke, others their position as subjects perceiving, observing, describing, teaching, etc. It can be said that this relation between different elements, some of which are new, while others were already in existence, is effected by clinical discourse. It is this, as a practice, that establishes between them all a system of relations that is not really given or constituted a priori, and if there is a unity, if the modalities of enunciation that it uses or to which it gives place are not simply juxtaposed by a series of historical contingencies, it is because it makes constant use of this group of relations. One further remark. Having noted the disparity of the types of enunciation in clinical discourse, I have not tried to reduce it by uncovering the formal structures, categories, modes of logical succession, types of reasoning and induction, forms of analysis and synthesis that may have operated in a discourse. I did not wish to reveal the rational organization that may provide statements like those of medicine with their element of intrinsic necessity. Nor did I wish to reduce to a single founding act or to a founding consciousness the general horizon of rationality against which the progress of medicine gradually emerged. Its efforts to model itself upon the exact sciences, the contraction of its methods of observation, the slow, difficult expulsion of the images or fantasies that inhabit it, the purification of its system of reasoning. Lastly, I have not tried to describe the empirical genesis nor the various component elements of the medical mentality. How this shift of interest on the part of the doctors came about, by what theoretical or experimental model they were influenced, what philosophy or moral thematics defined the climate of their reflection, to what questions, to what demands they had to reply, what efforts were required of them to free themselves from the traditional prejudices, by what ways they were led towards a unification and coherence that were never achieved, never reached by their knowledge. In short, I do not refer the various enunciative modalities to the unity of the subject, whether it concerns the subject regarded as the pure founding authority of rationality, or the subject regarded as an empirical function of synthesis. Neither the knowing nor the knowledge. In the proposed analysis, instead of referring back to the synthesis or the unifying function of a subject, the various enunciative modalities manifest his dispersion to the various statuses, the various sites, the various positions that he can occupy or be given when making a discourse, to the discontinuity of the planes from which he speaks, and if these planes are linked by a system of relations, this system is not established by the synthetic activity of a consciousness identical with itself, dumb and anterior to all speech, but by the specificity of a discursive practice. I shall abandon any attempt, therefore, to see discourse as a phenomenon of expression, the verbal translation of a previously established synthesis. Instead, I shall look for a field of regularity for various positions of subjectivity. Thus conceived, discourse is not the majestically unfolding manifestation of a thinking, knowing, speaking subject, but, on the contrary, a totality in which the dispersion of the subject and his discontinuity with himself may be determined. It is a space of exteriority in which a network of distinct sites is deployed. I showed earlier that it was neither by words nor by things that the regulation of the objects proper to a discursive formation should be defined. Similarly, it must now be recognized that it is neither by recourse to a transcendental subject nor by recourse to a psychological subjectivity that the regulation of its enunciations should be defined. That's the end of chapter 4.